The first rule they teach you when you grow up, where you grew up, is never owe anyone anything, because debts have a way of collecting themselves in ways you don't expect, and you learned that lesson the hard way the day your mother got sick, and the hospital said they could help, but only if you could pay. And you couldn't pay because the factory closed and the job. You had barely covered rent, and you sat in that waiting room staring at the floor tiles, counting them over and over, because counting was the only thing keeping you from screaming. That's when you met him. He wasn't a monster, not at first. He was just a man in a clean shirt who sat next to you and asked if you were okay. And you told him about your mother, and he nodded like he understood, and then he said, "I know a way to make money fast. Nothing illegal, just driving. Just moving things from one place to another," and you were so tired, so desperate, that you said yes. Before your brain could catch up with your mouth, he gave you an address, and a time and a promise, and you shook his hand and walked back to your mother's room, and held her hand and told her everything was going to be okay, and she smiled, because she always believed you, even when you didn't believe yourself. The first drive was easy. You picked up a package from a warehouse, and dropped it at a garage, and someone handed you an envelope full of cash, and you went home and paid the hospital, and your mother got better, and you thought that was the end, but it never is. He called again, a week later, and said, "One more drive. Just one more," and the money was double, and your mother needed more medication, and you told yourself it was just driving, just moving boxes, just helping a friend. You told yourself that. For 6 months you learned the roads, you learned the checkpoints, you learned which cops could be trusted, and which couldn't. You learned to recognize the cars that followed, and the cars that didn't. You learned that paranoia is just another word for staying alive. And then one night, everything changed. You showed up at the warehouse, like always, but this time, there were men you didn't recognize, and they didn't smile, and the package wasn't a box. It was a person, a man with a bag over his head, and bound hands, and you said, "I don't do this. I only drive things," and the man who hired you put his hand on your shoulder and said, "You drive what we tell you to drive." You wanted to walk away. You wanted to get back in your car and drive home, and pretend you never saw anything, but then he mentioned your mother's name, her full name, her address, her hospital room number, and he said it so casually, like he was talking about the weather, and you understood in that moment that there was no walking away. There never was. So you drove. The man in the back didn't make a sound the whole first hour, and that was worse than if he had screamed, because the silence told you he was used to this, that this wasn't his first time with a bag over his head. And you wondered what he had done, or what they thought he had done, and you wondered if the same bag would ever be over your head. The man next to you was young, younger than you, maybe 19, with a gun in his waistband that he kept touching like a child touching a security blanket, and you realized he was more scared than you were, and that made you more scared, because scared people do stupid things, and stupid things get people killed. You drove through the night with no headlights, because they told you no headlights, and you navigated by memory and moonlight, and the occasional glimpse of stars through the clouds, and you thought about how your mother used to point out constellations when you were small, and how you never paid attention, and now you wished you had, because knowing the stars might be the only thing between you and getting lost forever. The road turned to dirt, and then to nothing, and you were driving through open fields, with the car bumping and bouncing, and the man in the back hit his head against something and made a sound, finally a muffled cry, and the young man next to you flinched and almost pulled the gun, and you said, "Easy, easy, it's nothing, he's fine. Just keep watching the road." But you were both watching the road, because the road was all there, was around midnight. You saw lights behind you. At first you thought it was a farmhouse or a passing truck, but the lights didn't pass. They stayed, and they grew, and the young man turned around and said, "They're not supposed to be there. No one is supposed to be on this road." And you pressed the gas, and the car lurched forward, and the lights behind you got closer. You asked, "Who is it?" And he said, "I don't know." And you said, "Is it your people?" And he said, "I don't know." And you said, "Is there anyone else who knows this route?" And he just stared at the growing lights and didn't answer the Man in the back started thrashing, and the car swerved, and the young man hit him with the butt of the gun, and told him to be still, and you heard the man cry out, and then go quiet, and you wondered if he was dead, and you wondered if that made you complicit, and you realized you already were complicit the moment you took the first drive. The lights behind you were close. Now close enough that you could see they were trucks, black trucks with no markings, and you asked if they were police, and the young man laughed and said, "Police don't drive trucks like that." You took a sharp turn onto a road so small it was barely 2 tire tracks, and the trucks followed, because of course they followed, and you realized they knew the roads better than you did, and you were driving through someone else's territory, and you didn't know the rules. Here the young man rolled down his window and stuck his head out, and then pulled back in and said, "They're gaining," and you said, "I can see that," and he said, "What do we do?" and you said, "I don't know, you're the one with the gun," and he looked at the gun like he'd forgotten he had it, and then he looked at you, and you saw in his eyes that he was just a kid, a scared kid, who didn't want to die any more than you didn't. In that moment, something shifted. You weren't just driving for them anymore, you were driving for yourself. You were driving for the man in the back, who might be innocent or guilty, but didn't deserve to die in the trunk of a car. You were driving for the kid next to you, who had been given a gun and a choice, and no one to tell him right from wrong. You were driving because stopping meant dying. The road opened up onto a highway, and you merged without looking and heard horns blaring and saw headlights swerving, and the trucks behind you did the same, because they didn't care about anyone else on the road, they only cared about youth. Young man fired his gun out the window, and you screamed at him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Trying to slow them down," and you said, "You're going to hit someone," and he said, "Better them than us," and you hated him in that moment, and loved him too, because he was willing to do what you couldn't. The bullet hit your rear windshield, and it spiderwebbed into 1,000 cracks, and you couldn't see behind you anymore, only the glow of headlights through the shattered glass, and you realized they were shooting to kill, not to warn you. Asked if he had more bullets, and he said a few, and you told him to make them count, and he nodded, and you saw respect in his eyes, or maybe just fear, but it looked like respect, and that was enough. You took an exit so fast, the car lifted on 2 wheels, and came down hard, and the man in the back screamed again, and you thought, at least he's alive, at least they're not carrying a corpse. The exit led to a small town, empty streets, closed shops, a single street light flickering, and you drove through it praying no one would come out, no one would see, no one would remember your face. The trucks followed, of course they followed you, drove through the town and out the other side and into farmland again, and the road turned to gravel, and then to mud, and the car was sliding, and you were fighting the wheel, and the young man was gripping the dashboard, and the man in the back was silent. And you thought, this is it, this is where we die, in a field miles from anywhere. And then the road ended, not faded, not turned, not forked, just ended at a river, and you slammed the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop inches from the water, and you sat there breathing hard, and the young man said, "Now what?" And you looked at the river, and you looked at the lights behind you, growing closer, and you said, "We swim." He said, "I can't," and you said, "What?" And he said, "I can't swim," and you wanted to scream, but instead, you opened your door and ran to the back and opened the trunk and pulled out the man with the bag on his head and dragged him toward the water. And the young man stood there, frozen gun in hand, watching the lights approach. You yelled, "Come on," and he shook his head, and you saw his face in the moonlight, and he looked 12 years old, and you realized he wasn't a killer. He was just a boy who got lost, and now he was going to die because he couldn't swim. The trucks stopped behind you, and doors opened, and men got out, and you heard voices, and you knew you had seconds. You dropped the bound man at the water's edge, and ran back to the young man and grabbed his arm and said, "I won't leave you," and he looked at you like no one had ever said those words to him before, and you pulled him toward the water, and the men behind you started shooting, and you both dove into the dark river just as bullets hit the surface around you. Water was cold, colder than you expected, and you surfaced gasping and looked for the young man and saw him struggling, and you swam to him, and grabbed him, and told him to hold on to you, and he did, and you kicked toward the far bank with one arm and held him with the other, and bullets still hit the water, but they were blind shots now, because the men on the shore couldn't see you in the dark. You reached the other side and crawled onto the mud and collapsed, and the young man lay beside you coughing up water and crying, and you held him because there was nothing else to do. The bound man was gone. You looked across the river and saw the trucks and the men and the flashlights searching, and you knew they wouldn't stop looking tonight or tomorrow or the next day, because people like them don't stop. They can't stop, because stopping means losing, and losing means dying. You pulled the young man to his feet, and you walked into the trees, and you walked all night. When dawn came, you found a road, and a gas station, and a phone, and you didn't know who to call, because the police might be theirs, and your mother might be watched, and you had nothing, no money, no plan, no future. You called your mother. She answered on the first ring, and you heard her voice, and you couldn't speak for a moment, and she said hello, hello, and finally you said it's me, and she started crying, and said, where are you? And you said, I can't tell you, but I'm alive, and I'm coming home. She said they came to the house and you felt your heart stop, and she said they asked about you, and I said I didn't know anything, and they left, but they'll be back, and you said I know, and she said what did you do? And you said I tried to help you, and she said I never asked you to do this, and you said I know you didn't, but I did it anyway. You hung up and stood there in the phone booth watching the sun rise, and the young man sat on the ground with his head in his hands, and you realized you didn't even know his name. You asked him, and he said it doesn't matter, and you said it matters to me, and he looked up and said Miguel, and you nodded and said, I'm nobody. Now, just like you walked. For days you walked through fields and forests and small towns where you stole food from gardens, and drank from hoses, and slept in barns, and Miguel stayed with you because he had nowhere else to go, and you let him because you couldn't save yourself and leave him behind. At night, you talked about your lives before the warehouse, before the packages, before the men with guns, and you learned that his mother died when he was young, and his father was in prison, and he had been recruited because he was alone, and alone people are easy to take. You told him about your mother in the hospital and the roof you fixed, and he said you did it for love, and you said, I did it for love, and it might cost me everything. He said that's what love does sometimes. One night you were sleeping in an abandoned church, and you woke to the sound of engines, and you grabbed Miguel, and ran to the back, and hid behind the altar, as flashlights swept through the windows, and men kicked open the doors, and you held your breath, and prayed to a God you weren't sure you believed in. They searched, and they left, and you waited an hour before moving, and Miguel's hand was shaking in yours, and you realized you were holding hands like children. Afraid of the dark, you walked south, because south meant the border, and the border meant a chance, and Miguel asked what you would do when you crossed, and you said find my mother, bring her here, start over, and he said what if they find you? And you said they won't, and he said they always do. You didn't have an answer for that. On the 10th day you reached a river, and on the other side was another country, and you stood at the edge and remembered the last river, the one you crossed in the dark, with bullets in the water, and Miguel stood beside you, and said, this time I can swim. You laughed, and it felt strange, like a muscle you hadn't used in years. You crossed together, and on the other side, you kept walking because walking was all you knew. Now and eventually you found a town and a shelter and people who helped people like you, people who had run from things and people who understood that home isn't a place, it's a memory. You called your mother from another phone and told her where you were, and she said she would come, and you said it's dangerous, and she said, you're my son, I would cross oceans. She came 3 weeks later. She stepped off a bus, and you saw her through the window, and you ran outside and held her, and you cried for the first time since that night, and she held you and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. Miguel stood a few feet away and watched, and you motioned for him to come, and you introduced him as family, because that's what he was now. You found work and a small apartment, and you lived quietly and looked over your shoulders and checked the locks and taught Miguel to do the same. Years passed. You got older, and your mother got older, and Miguel became a man with a family of his own, and sometimes late at night you sat together and remembered the river and the trucks and the man with the bag on his head, who you never saw again, and you wondered if he made it, if someone found him, if he ever knew that a stranger risked everything to drag him toward Waterland. Sometimes you woke in the dark hearing bullets and seeing headlights, and you would sit up in bed and wait for your heart to slow and remind yourself that you were here, that you made it, that the past was behind you, but it's never really behind you, is it? It walks beside you like a shadow, and on certain days when the light hits a certain way, you see it clearly, and you remember who you were and what you did and what you had to become to survive. Not proud of everything you drove for them, you carried their packages, you looked the other way, and you can spend the rest of your life trying to balance that scale, and you never will, because some debts can't be paid, but you also saved a boy who couldn't swim. You also held your mother at the border. You also looked into the dark and chose to keep going, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can do. Choose to keep going, even when everything says stop, even when the road ends, even when the water is cold and the bullets are flying. You choose to swim, you choose to hold on, you choose to love even when love is the thing that got you here, and you live not because you deserve to, but because you refuse to die, because somewhere in you there was a voice that said keep driving, keep driving, keep driving, and you listened down. That voice is still there, it will always be there, and on the nights when the headlights come back in your dreams and the man next to you touches his gun and the man in the back goes silent, you hear it keep driving, keep driving, keep driving, and you do, you always do, because that's who you are. Now, not the driver who ran for the cartel, but the one who ran from them, the one who crossed rivers and borders in fear itself, the one who lived. And as you sit on your porch years later, watching the sunset with your mother beside you, and Miguel down the street with his own family, and the world quiet for once, you realize that living is its own kind of victory, not flashy, not heroic, just ordinary and beautiful and hard-won. And you take a breath and you let it out slow, and you think about that kid in the phone booth watching the sunrise, and you want to tell him it's okay. You want to tell him he makes it. You want to tell him that the road ahead is long but worth it, but you can't. So instead, you just sit there and feel the sun on your face and listen to your mother breathe, and know that this moment, this simple quiet moment, is what you were driving toward all along, home. A place, a feeling, a truth. You made it toward home.